Welcome to the launch of the Civil Service of the Law Family Commission on Civil Society. I'm glad to say we have hundreds of people logged in, which is tremendous. I'm Gus O'Donnell, chair of the Commission and chair of the trustees of Pro Bono Economics. In a former life, I went from academic economist to civil servant and eventually cabinet secretary for Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. Since 2009, Pro Bono Economics has been engaged with over 500 charities, harnessing the skills of volunteer economists to help charities better understand and enhance their impact. And building on that 11 years experience, we want to, through this commission, unleash the potential of civil society. So to think about what we've learned over these years and to learn from all the people that are inputting into this commission to actually help civil society get even better. We will be looking at three different areas, the public, the private, and the charity sector, because we very firmly believe that you need to understand how all of these different sectors interact. So it's not just about any one of them, it's about how, as a system, this works. This is very important to me because as an economist, I remember teaching economics where there'd be the public sector and the private sector, but no one would ever say anything at all about the charitable sector, the civic society. And that was, to my mind, a real gap. And it reflected a feeling that, this was the third sector, a residual, something left over. And that, I think, is fundamentally wrong. We need to give civil society a voice around the table. So the end result of the commission, we're really about outcomes and impact, will be practical, implementable decisions that can really make a difference. So ideas that will help civil society unleash its full potential. Today we have two publications. The first is a 21 essay collection, which has got some brilliant essays in from a whole range of different people across the spectrum of politics, the charity sector, ex-central bankers, would you believe it, like Andy Haldane and Andy's still a central banker, and Raghuram Rajan. So brilliant set of people. It is, of course, worth mentioning COVID. That's been a real challenge to the sector. It's massively increased the demand placed upon the charitable sector, and at the same time, the resources it gets, because charity shops are closed, those marathons that we'd all be running and sponsoring aren't taking place. So there's a challenge from both ends. We've seen in the survey work that Pro Bono Economics have done that burst of community spirit. I call it social togetherness. That was tremendous right at the start of the pandemic, but it's fallen off. The numbers volunteering in the second lockdown, much slower. The number of people feeling that the community is there to help them, from the ONS surveys, we know this, has diminished. And that's a great shame. And we need to think about how we build that back up as the government gets into its reset agenda for building back better and leveling up. And we know that COVID has had some dramatic increases in inequality because the differential impact of lockdown has affected different people in different ways. So these are really big challenges. We are hoping that this commission can make a big difference for the role of charities in the longer term, but also build on these shorter term issues. It'll last for 2 years, and we will have interim publications along the way. Today, the plan is we will have the Secretary of State speaking to us, Oliver Dowden, and then the Shadow Minister of the Cabinet Office, Rachel Reeves. Then we'll have a panel with various really important speakers, and there'll be time for you to ask questions after that. Just to be clear, if anyone wants to tweet on the event, please use the hashtag #PBE events. And the plan is that we will wrap up the event around 12:30. Just as in any good TV series that we're all watching, you start with the previously, what's been happening up to date, and we have a little video to tell you the state of the civil society sector at the moment and what the challenges are. So cue video, then we'll move on to the Secretary of State.
Hi.
Hi, are you all right?
Hello, hello.
How are you?
Okay, thank you. How are we doing?
Good, thanks.
I'm well, thank you.
Excellent.
Fine, it's been a rather long day.
So yeah, no, I'm good. Let's chat.
I think it's important that we have a much better understanding of the contribution that civil society organisations make.
Civil society for me is the foundation on which we're built.
When we look at who's there championing everyone, especially those people who need someone to fight for them, it's civil society.
This is the sector that provides the societal glue, that seals up the cracks that risk appearing in our economies.
Charities alone generate about £200 billion worth of value every year for our economy, about 10% of the country's GDP. This is a major economic force, a major force for good, really.
We know there are many people in society who are vulnerable, who are in need of support, and yet the structures in place in society find it very hard to reach them.
A lot of the communities that I work alongside feel like we're very much outside the room when these big conversations happen, and we feel like we're shouting at closed doors a lot of the time.
Civil society needs to be heard in the boardroom and in the corridors of Whitehall. They need to be there. They need to have a voice around the table.
We've got to rethink how we operate. The challenges ahead are huge, and unless we collaborate, we are not going to get the best out of anything.
So the purpose of the Law Family Commission on Civil Society is to actually work out how civil society can play a really effective role in making our society better.
We've got a tremendous cast of 17 commissioners working alongside pro bono economics.
The Commission will run for 2 years, looking really at everything from the future of volunteering through to really quite the technical stuff around how we measure, how we value.
There's such an opportunity to unlock all the people who work in more commercially driven enterprises who are also just human beings who want to contribute to the world that they live in.
Businesses and investors are increasingly starting to act with purpose, but civil society can check that.
Our polling shows that 84% of people think that charity is an important part of our society. But there is a sense as well that there's some room for improvement out there. So only 10% of us think that the sector is really acting at the top of its game right now. So that's really what we want the Commission to be focusing on the next 2 years.
Working cross-sector, working collaboratively is absolutely essential because that's how the way our world works now.
I think the magic happens at the intersections when you have someone who has a completely different point of view with you. If you can really listen and persist in that space, then you'll probably unlock something spectacular.
We think this is the moment when policymakers will follow the ideas that this generates.
I think now absolutely is the time to re-establish that third pillar, to give it the same stature as the market and the state.
Coming together, sharing our expertise, putting in the resources where required, committing to being there for the long run, and changing the lot of the most vulnerable. That's the only way we're going to be able to do it, but we can do it if we make that kind of commitment.
This is a real moment where civil society can be like, this is our time.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope some of it is of some use.
Speak to you soon.
Good luck with it.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
All the best.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Great. Well, as we said at the end there, this is our time, but now is the time for the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. You all know as MP for Hertsmere, former Special Advisor to David Cameron, and as we now all know, big fan of Scotch eggs. So, Oliver, over to you.
Well, thank you, Gus, and thank you for that introduction. I'm actually a fan of Scotch eggs. I got some excellent ones from my local butcher. I was telling my special advisors about that, but we decided not to brief that one out. And thank you for your introduction. And I think this is a really important project, and I'm so pleased to be here at the launch of the Law Family Commission on civil society. And it's customary for a minister or a secretary of state at these sort of events to say that they have read the report with interest. But genuinely, this morning ahead of this event, I was reading the report, and I think it is a genuinely valuable start of an important contribution. And I was particularly struck by some words in the foreword from Andrew Law, where he said that the intention of this commission is to determine how best to coordinate the millions of individual acts of benevolence that take place every day in our nation as men and women enthusiastically choose to trouble themselves further, and how to multiply those efforts up to the betterment of the entire United Kingdom. That really is the essence for me of the challenge that we face as a government. And as I look across my responsibilities for civil society, that is the challenge I am setting officials, and that's the challenge that I'm working to address. So in these opening remarks, I just wanted to touch on my thoughts on a few of those things to kick off this process. The first starting point has to be the challenges faced by civil society as a result of the COVID pandemic this year. And I know how incredibly hard hit civil society has been. As you were saying at the beginning, Gus, unable to fundraise face-to-face, unable to open charity shops, cafes and other retail outlets. And particularly, this is at a time when the public has looked to the sector for frontline support, perhaps more than at any point in its history. And the Commission's report identifies one key challenge, first and foremost, and that's what you rightly call our collective failure to properly value what civil society delivers. I want to be clear up front that this really is not the government's attitude, and I would judge us by our actions. And one of the first interventions that I secured as Secretary of State, and the first non-cross economy intervention of any significance secured with the Treasury, was a £750 million investment we made into the sector when COVID hit. And this was to ensure that it could keep delivering essential support to those who needed it most. So it was not just the first sector-specific financial intervention my department sought, not one of the first that the Treasury granted across the entire economy, but it was by far the biggest package of its kind in Europe and a clear signal of our intent. Because in the unique challenges that it posed and the enormous response required, I think COVID really demonstrated beyond doubt that we can't afford not to value civil society. But at the same time, the wider context for civil society has shifted. And when this pandemic hit, we all saw it. There's this tremendous surge of goodwill in our communities. And I saw it in my own constituency. And the Commission's research bears this out. It's found that 18 million people in England helped friends or neighbours during the first lockdown by doing their shopping or walking the dog. So there is clearly a strong appetite in the community for helping good causes. And when we look back on this extraordinary year, I think it is a good moment to stop and reflect and try to answer two very important questions, which this initial report also touches on. First of all, how do we capitalise on that surge of goodwill, on the army of volunteers who put their hands up during COVID, and make sure that the epidemic of kindness we saw, particularly during that first wave, and we've witnessed across the last 12 months, continues beyond this pandemic? And secondly, what lessons can we take from the past year, from the way civil society has had to radically adapt? And does COVID offer us and civil society a new way forward? So first of all, in terms of what the government can do, first of all, one of the challenges I think here is how we unleash the potential of a civil society. And I use the term unleash deliberately there because I strongly believe, as your report rightly highlights, that there is a huge power in civil society and that it should be the government's job to unlock it, but not try to replace it, and certainly not to stymie in it, and not seeking to run things from the top down, which, as you all know, is one of the big challenges of governments, but seeking to steward the sector, unlocking resources and empowering volunteers. So my first priority for the government's work in this area is how can we focus in on where it is most needed and where we can most add value. Now, the way the sector uses digital and data is a great example of this. The Commission's report talks about the digital deficit, about how more than 1 in 3 charities say they don't have the resources to invest in technology. But I've actually been struck during this pandemic by the way that charities have innovated and adapted, particularly through the use of digital technology. And indeed, we've seen this across the wider economy, but civil society has stepped up to the plate as well. 92% of organisations have moved their services online as a result of COVID. And the government has played an important role here too. A significant amount of the £200 million that we've made available to small and medium-sized charities through the Coronavirus Community Support Fund is being spent on helping them to digitalise their offer. And I know that charities can't deliver everything online, and that some of their most important work, the really vital stuff, is of course done face-to-face. But one of COVID's positive legacies could be the way that it's helped digitalise the sector for the long term. And of course, going digital means more data, and it means making it easier both to evaluate and boost an organisation's impact. And in my wider role as Secretary of State, the D of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can make better use of data in the wider economy. In fact, it's one of those areas where I actually think we can make a really significant impact now that we have left the EU. And just as data isn't always well used in the public sector, your report highlights the data deficit in civil society. 87% of charities say a focus on impactful measurement is important in delivering their objectives, but fewer than half of them describe their knowledge and use of such opportunities as good or very good. And in truth, I think the government has exactly the same sort of data deficit. And the early stages of the COVID crisis actually showed, if we're being frank with one another, that Whitehall didn't know as much about civil society as we thought we did, where the volunteers were, which charities were best placed to step in and support public services, and what the real picture of its financial health was. And that really does matter, as anyone involved in government or wider civil society will tell you. Without that understanding, we in government can't be as effective in supporting the sector or making the most of what it has to offer. So I've made it a priority for my department to build up that knowledge, bring in the new skills and tools in order to do so. And that was an important part of our settlement for the Office for Civil Society in the recent spending review. And I hope that it will bear fruit in the coming months as we take a different approach. A second challenge I wanted to highlight, and this of course is another one that the Commission report also alights upon, is how we can bring more resources into the sector. And of course, not all of it can come from the same old sources. We need to look at bold new ways to raise funds. So for example, your report rightly highlights what you described as the philanthropic deficit in this country. And this is something that I've come across many times and that I've discussed with the Chancellor as well. While the UK is undoubtedly a generous nation, and we saw that abundance during the pandemic, we do lag significantly behind other countries such as the US, to an equivalent of an estimated about £45 billion a year. Now that's very nearly the entire income of our charity sector. So I want to know how we can use philanthropy more in this country in the future. Why is it that we don't get philanthropy on the same scale as you see in the US? And what role can the government play in stimulating it? And as part of that work, my excellent colleague, Baroness Barron, the Minister for Civil Society, is doing some very important work on leveraging funding. We've actually had a couple of recent examples of it. So first of all, we matched the BBC's Big Night In, where we supported public generosity to the same tune. And secondly, as part of our COVID response, the £85 million Community Match Fund Challenge doubled investment by government by unlocking support from philanthropists, foundations and grant-making organisations. A great example that I would hope we can build upon. But it's also becoming increasingly clear that a growing number of people are looking to invest their money in companies and organisations that align with their values. And I think this is a particularly a trend amongst younger people as they start to make money and look to invest. They're looking at how they can drive social value from their investments. And we're also looking at how we can drive impact investment. So that in the same way people can now make green investments driving towards net zero, we want to look at how this can be applied to other social challenges and the work being done by civil society to sit alongside investment government is making. And we're also looking to expand the UK's dormant asset schemes. This is money that's sitting in unused accounts, begging to be used to tackle some of society's most pressing challenges. And we've seen large amounts of money already being made available from this. And very shortly, we'll be publishing our response to a consultation on the expansion of that scheme. And another area of activity in this space is the National Lottery. I do think we need to ask some important questions about the National Lottery. It was established now almost 25 years ago, and it's only really undergone one change since then, when the Labour government changed the way funding was distributed. I'm keen over the longer run, particularly as we move to a comprehensive spending review, to review where that balance lies. And in particular, during this pandemic, we've seen how valuable organisations like grassroots sports clubs are to their communities. And I want to see how we can best use those sort of existing organisations to help communities so that we can make the most of our strong assets on the ground and assets with which many parts of the community are engaged, and often parts of the community that aren't engaged in wider civil society. And thirdly, and my final point of priority I'd like to highlight, which again the report picks up on, is how we build on this early enthusiasm for volunteering and the concern, which I think the report rightly highlights, that this sense of community is already beginning to wane. But of course, we do hear from so many people, and particularly the young, that they really do want to get involved in volunteering. The will is there, but there are just too many obstacles in the way. One person might volunteer to work in a care home, for instance, and have to go through a whole process of checks to do so. And then when they find they want to volunteer in a nearby care home, they have to do the same thing and go through the same process. And inevitably, it deters people. So how can the government seek to simplify those sort of processes and make sure the spirit of pandemic volunteering lasts on long beyond this crisis? And in that vein, my colleague Danny Kruger has done some valuable work talking about how a volunteer passport could be used to coordinate the supply and demand of volunteers. And that's something that we're looking at very closely. And we've already strengthened our links with voluntary organisations through the Voluntary and Community Sectors Emergency Partnership. And again, we gave that £4.8 million worth of grant to help during the coronavirus. And that's set us up to work together much better in the future. And these efforts are all part of one of the government's most central goals, which is, of course, levelling up across the country. And clearly that levelling up extends to civil society. And the one thing we've learned from COVID is that those areas that already had a strong volunteering infrastructure were better able to respond to the crisis and do so much more effectively and much quicker than those without. So one of the challenges how can we level up the country so that even when the next crisis hits, everyone can have a similar level of access to rapid support. And this is an important part of the government's new £4 billion levelling up fund. And Danny Kruger's report recommended it, and it's a central part of the spending review. But now we have that funding, we really need to make sure that it goes to where it's most needed. And to do that, I do want to make sure, and I think one of your contributors in the opening introduction to this made this point, we need to ensure that decisions aren't just made by people sitting in offices like this one in central London. It should be driven and directed by the communities on the ground. So in conclusion, as I've touched on throughout this, a lot of it comes down to data analytics and getting a clearer picture of how things stand. And one of the most important things we can do is to try and understand not just the health of the sector, but its value. And as Andy Haldane, one of the central figures involved in this work you're doing, highlighted in a lecture last year, the collective contribution of civil society to our economy and society is hugely underestimated by current economic measures. And that's why this commission is so very important, and why we'll be both waiting to hear its outcome, but also working closely with you throughout the process. And Gus, probably better than anyone else, knows that my job is to quantify to the Treasury in terms they understand what all of us are speaking about now, that civil society is not just special, but it's incredibly important. And I really do look forward to working with all of you to make that case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if we had an audience, we could all applaud that, because there's lots in there to welcome. We don't have much time, but just two questions, if you could cover these. First of all, we have a lot of charities listening in here, and they will want to know how best to engage with you, with DCMS and with the department, to get their message across, to be saying, look, here are the things we think should be happening. How best to do that? And secondly, you mentioned the spending review there. How far do you think that we might end up with departments having cuts that might make it even more difficult for you to do your job?
And well, let me take the second first in usual politician fashion, but I think it's an important point that sort of leads on to the first one. Actually, and if the Chancellor was here, he'd make this point more strongly. I think given the economic constraints that we have been under, and the fact that it's a one-year spending review settlement, I think there's quite a lot of money going into our core priorities, particularly in health and education. In terms, and indeed local government, which has been very hard hit by this crisis, I think what I have sought to do in the discussions in the run-up to the spending review and working with the Treasury is to try and provide some focus to the Office for Civil Society, which sits within my department. Because given the size of my department and the size of the budgets that were inevitably attached to the Office for Civil Society, I don't think its role is best in delivering. And I think if we try to be a delivery department, we can't compete with health or education or MHCLG. But what I think we can do is to try and be the enabling department. So whether that is in terms of making sure we're well resourced in terms of ensuring proper structures for civil society, making those sort of linkages, working across with civil societies. That's what I've tried to do. And the settlement reflects that, a movement away from delivering a small number of patchwork projects to a more coherent approach to engagement with the sector, which in turn leads to your first question. I think it is a challenge. And as I highlighted in my opening remarks, I think just understanding the challenges is one of the most important things. So getting a better data picture, working with you on that, opening up different channels of communication with you. Diana Barron, who's the Lord's Minister and works absolutely tirelessly in this area, has done an awful lot of work to work across voluntary organisations. And I think Gus, you were saying this at the beginning, one of my huge worries about our response to this pandemic, which was necessary to control the virus and prevent much, much worse consequences. This is one of the challenges we have, is to communicate to people that the pain that we've taken now is to prevent much worse things that would have happened but for it. But there are big costs in terms of the impact on young people, mental health, and so on. And those are going to be felt for a long time to come. So how we can make sure that we don't just stop as hopefully this crisis comes to an end through the spring and summer, but we actually work together to have a long-term coordinated response.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We now have to move on, but thank you very much for that. And we look forward to engaging with you throughout the life of the Commission. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Now, we move to our next speaker, who is Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office and the MP for Leeds West. Known Rachel for quite a long time. I was just looking at, so we know that Oliver likes Scotch eggs, but what don't we know about Rachel? And in investigating Wikipedia, that well-known, possibly sometimes not quite accurate, those of us who've been watching the Queen's Gambit will know that female chess players are what it's all about. And we are about to hear from Britain's under-14 girls chess champion. Why didn't you carry it on, Rachel? You could have been a star of TV and screen rather than a politician. What happened?
So many other choices and directions my life could have gone in, Gus. And I think I first met you when I was an undergraduate and did some work experience at the Treasury many years ago. Thanks for those kind words of introduction, and also to Andy, who I also worked with at the Bank of England, for inviting me to share some reflections with you today. My professional background, as many of you will know, is in economics. And before I became an MP, as well as dabbling in chess tournaments, I spent much time in front of spreadsheets and equations as an economist at the Bank of England and elsewhere. But like many of you here today, what really motivates me is not those spreadsheets, but the lives of people, and ensuring that more people can lead a good and productive life and with meaning. One of the most exciting aspects of the brief that I have in Keir Starmer's Shadow Cabinet, and it was a privilege in April to be asked to rejoin the Shadow Cabinet by Keir, is to develop some of Labour's long-term thinking after 4 election defeats, but also after the coronavirus pandemic. It is impossible, I think, to achieve either a fairer economy or a stronger society without civil society. Yet in the political arena, I feel that civil society is often overlooked and probably undervalued as well. For too long, the impression has been that the civil society is there in some way to compensate, either to plug holes because of the limitations of the state or to compensate for market failure. It is often defined more against both the public and private sectors rather than on its own merits. I think even the phrase not for profit is inadequate to explain the purpose of so many different organisations, large and small, whether formally or informally, delivering services or giving voice to others. It is not the absence of profit that defines civil society, but it's its heart, I believe, the full value of people. How would traditional policymakers classify a young England football player who has motivated thousands of people, business and communities to provide meals for children during the October half term when government decided not to do so? It's impossible to talk about our care for those in communities without fully understanding the essence of civil society. And we must never shy away from talking about the challenges, the inequalities and injustice that too often permeate our society and our communities. And we cannot begin to understand the power and potential of civil society if we fail to appreciate the desire for dignity and the appreciation of kindness, a joy in togetherness, shared determination, and the silent struggle or the enduring need to be heard and understood. The value of civil society has been demonstrated, I think we can all agree, time and time again over the last few months during this pandemic. And I think it's brought out in many ways the very best in people, springing into action to meet the most urgent demands. And I see that very much in my constituency in West Leeds. Take Armley Helping Hands, a community organisation that's been going for just over 25 years now. It is primarily there to support older people in the community. But during the pandemic, it has been the hub for awards serving around 20,000 people, some of the most vulnerable and some of the areas of the highest levels of poverty in the whole of Leeds, indeed in the whole of the country. They provide food parcels and prescriptions to the vulnerable, but also they provided a listening service where anyone, young or old, can phone up if they are struggling with loneliness, with isolation, with mental health. And at the moment, they're also packaging up hampers for Christmas. And on Christmas Day, they're going to be serving hot meals delivered to the doorstep for some of the people in my community who are struggling most, and particularly at this time of year. Or take the New Wortley Community Centre. They've provided hot meals to the community from those of greatest need. And they've also spearheaded a wonderful project working with young people at the 2 local primary schools to write letters to older people in care homes to bridge some of those generational divides and to ensure that nobody feels alone at these times. And also to, I hope, to develop a greater level of empathy and understanding about the different challenges that young and old people are experiencing during this time. And the wonderful thing is that letter writing has continued after it was formally a school project a few months ago. Loneliness is also an issue that particularly motivates me. When my friend and colleague Jo Cox died in 2016, I said in the Houses of Parliament that it now falls on all of our shoulders to take forward Jo's work because she's no longer able to. And one of the issues that she was passionate about was tackling loneliness in all of our communities. And although Jo had worked in some of the toughest places in the world, places devastated by war and famine, it didn't inoculate her to the challenges that we face here at home in the United Kingdom. And one of those that she saw in her constituency of Batley and Spen was the hidden crisis of loneliness in all of our communities. And it was one of the greatest privileges of my 10 or so years in Parliament to co-chair with Seema Kennedy, a former Conservative MP, the Jo Cox Commission on Loneliness, very much putting into expression what Jo spoke about, that we have more in common than that which divides us. But also I remarked when we published our manifesto on loneliness that William Beveridge, if he had been writing his report today, he would have identified loneliness, I believe, as one of the great evils in society. And similar to 1945, I believe we need the same sort of focus and energy to tackle those giant evils in society today, including that of loneliness and social isolation. In 2017, we knew that 9 million people were always or often lonely. We can only begin to imagine what that statistic is today. And we all must do more, civil society, public and private sectors together, to work to tackle that crisis. I recognise that times are incredibly hard for many people who are involved in civil society organisations at the moment. And as patron of two Leeds charities, Bramley Elderly Action and also Leeds Women's Aid, the challenges that you're going through. Last week, the spending review and the OBR report showed a stark economic picture. Every day we hear on Radio 4 whether the FTSE 100 index has gone up or down, yet we struggle to give measure or to give prominence to social capital, which I think we all know has much more of an impact on people's everyday lives. The UK is not just in the midst of an economic recession, but also a recession of a social recession. And we have been in that for some time now. A decade of austerity has undermined resilience nationally within our communities and in our homes and our families as well. Precarious work may provide greater flexibility for employers, but it makes it incredibly hard for families and individuals to plan their lives and plan for the future. Our social security safety net has been torn and it is often inadequate. Not even a pandemic requiring people to self-isolate in the national interest has encouraged this government to address the problem of statutory sick pay, currently the lowest in any OECD country, resulting in people who are ill not isolating as they should do, because to do so would be to make the choice not to put food on the table. And that choice between your health and also the health of our communities and being able to feed our family and pay the bills, I think is an impossible choice for many people to make. And it's not a choice that they should have to make, either for them and their families, but also for the wider good. And it's one of the reasons why we've struggled to get on top of this virus, is people have not been given the support to isolate, despite the best efforts of civil society, like New Wortley Community Centre and Armley Helping Hands with the food parcels and the listening projects. The problem is that people are not given the financial support to take the decisions that they know are right for them and their families. But alongside the poverty that we see, there also seems to be an insatiable appetite for more consumption. We are bombarded with messages of consumption, while our landfill sites are filling and our planet is burning. Clean air in too many of our cities, including in large parts of Leeds, is a luxury, but it is a luxury that all of us should be able to enjoy. Technology enables us to rapidly communicate, work and engage throughout the world and bring people together at a fraction of the cost and the time that used to mean. But it can also easily interrupt and intrude into family life and all of the problems that brings. Our high streets matter to millions, yet our tax policy and practice rewards clicks over bricks. That is not right. And the problems, I don't think, are just limited to the private sector. Public contracts are given without tender to friends and to the powerful, while many others are unable to even get to the door, never mind through it. There will be many working in civil society who know firsthand how hard it is for their organisations to bid for, let alone win, public sector contracts. And they'll be aghast at some of the procurement process we've seen during this pandemic, particularly when it comes to PPE, to contact tracing and testing, but also in many other areas as well. Many institutions, I recognise, are viewed with suspicion, and all too often it seems that it is resented by government. Ministerial codes of conduct appear to be written in invisible ink, while they should be written in capital letters and in permanent. Decisions are made too far away from people and communities, and England is one of the most centralised countries in the world, and it is not healthy. And the way that the government approached the Mayor of Greater Manchester, among others, whose requests for economic support during the pandemic and when higher levels of restrictions were imposed, reinforced the perceptions that the government was doing things to people rather than with them. And it was one of the rare times, I must say, of rare cross-Pennine solidarity with the people of Leeds and very much supporting the actions and the demands of the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the people in that great city. But it is deeper than this. Many of you instinctively know that participation is as important as representation. And that is why Labour's ambition for devolution must not be limited just to elected politicians, but in empowering all communities as well. A devolution of power from Whitehall to town halls is not sufficient to properly ensure that people are empowered to change their lives and improve their communities. The last government, Labour government, tried this to some extent, especially in some of the most economically disadvantaged areas, in helping create space and resource for civil society to make change in regeneration. Regeneration, sadly, is a word I don't think that we hear very much right now. This has to be revisited and revised for the future challenges and opportunities that we face as a country. The Labour Party and the Labour movement were very much built on the voluntarism of trade unions and the cooperative movement and others. Yet, if I'm honest, our recent history, our ideas have often seemed overly statist and our language bureaucratic, and before that, consumerist. None of those are adequate for the challenges and the times that we live in today. Under Keir Starmer's leadership, this is changing. Our party will be talking more about the everyday concerns of people, emphasising the importance of our communities and in the places that we make home. Relationships matter, and I want to see more policy designed in future with the express aim of bringing people together and help all of us live flourishing lives, representing and understanding the value of family and community. But nor can we ignore the emergency facing so many organisations right now. Our excellent Shadow Minister for the Voluntary and Community Sector, Rachel Maskell, has highlighted how the current crisis is made worse by COVID-19. The collapse in fundraising and insufficient financial support from the sector, from government, tragically means that viable charities and community organisations risk going to the wall at the time when demand is highest. And it's not helped by the huge contraction of support available to local government because of the austerity we've seen not just over the last 10 years, but the failure of central government to fully compensate local government for the additional costs that they have to bear during this crisis at the same time that their revenues are falling as well. And that is why Labour thinks that the voluntary and community and civil society sector needs a bailout. But this is just a start. We believe that to reset the relationship between the civil society sector and the public sector is necessary so that we have a partnership of equals. Labour wants charities and the community organisations to play their full role in changing society. Democracy is deeper than sporadic elections. It is about what happens in between and what happens with citizens' voice, rights and power. That requires guarding the independence and voice of civil society, and is why measures in the Lobbying Act that mutes so many really must go and would go under a Labour government. Your voice is your most important asset, and the whole country benefits when voluntary organisations and charities can speak truth to power. The challenge of rebuilding our society post-COVID will simply fail without the vital participation of civil society. We need a new era of collaboration and co-production for the common good. The sector must be around the decision-making tables, drawing on your vast experience to help shape the future. And that is why the Law Family Commission for Civil Society is so important, because it can transform thinking. Now is the time and the occasion for a civic surge to put people at the heart of thinking, of creating new solutions and recognising the value of participation and not just the value of outcomes. When I look at the members of this commission and the aims and purpose, I know that you will challenge, interrogate and inspire political parties and decision makers from Whitehall to town halls and in the grassroots of our communities, where I think it is the most important. The pandemic is shining a spotlight on who we are as a country. COVID-19 may have shown that we are all in the same storm, but we're certainly not all in the same boat. There are 26 blocks of high-rise flats in my constituency of Leeds West, and the experience of families and people on their own living in those flats is very, very different from the experience of people who live in homes with gardens, and very different from people who live with people they love, rather than people who don't always mean them well. The key workers who are the backbone of Britain deserve a pay rise. Our community organisations should be expanding and reasserting the public realm, and it is the job of government, locally and nationally, to be on their side. Sadly, so often what is measured matters. The Commission will prove, I believe, to be an important moment in weighing the true value of civil society, and it is time for us all to meet the new challenges of our age. This time 160 years ago, John Ruskin was writing about what matters during a time of great and tumultuous change. He said, "There is no wealth but life. That country is the richest, which nourishes the greatest numbers of noble and happy human beings." He wrote this 160 years ago, but Ruskin could be writing about life today. I'm excited by this new Commission for Civil Society and what it will mean for our country and our future, and I wish you well in this crucial endeavour. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. That was inspiring. That told us all about the challenges we face. I particularly like the idea of speaking truth unto power. That's quite close to what I spent quite a lot of my career doing. And I really like your idea of rival factions coming together, Leeds and Manchester. You gave us an example. And here we have a Leeds MP praising a Manchester United footballer. I mean, that must be career limiting for you. But thank you very much for all of that. We look forward to engaging with you and coming together to meet these challenges jointly and coming up with answers which we can hopefully get cross-party support for, bringing all the rival factions together. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gus. I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you for the best. Bye-bye. So now we must move on swiftly to our next speaker, who is Andrew Law. Andrew has been an unfailing supporter of pro bono economics right from the start. He's the chairman of Speakers for Schools. He's the vice chair of the New School Network and a member of the Sutton Trust Strategic Advisory Board. And the Law Family Charitable Foundation is funding the work of the Law Family Commission on Civil Society. Andrew's clearly also had a very successful career in the financial sector with Caxton Associates, which he's chairman and CEO. So Andrew, over to you, and many thanks for the support you've given us over the years.
Thank you very much, Gus. I'm delighted to be with you all this morning to introduce the Commission. My wife, Zoe, and I set up the Law Family Charitable Foundation nearly a decade ago. My experience since, both as a philanthropist and through business, has made me both a spectator and a participant as civil society has evolved in recent years. Our purpose in supporting this commission is that it will help provide the ideas, the evidence and the impetus for civil society to fulfil its enormous potential in the UK moving forwards. The boundaries between the state, private companies and the so-called third sector were already blurring, of course, before COVID, and that process has now just been exponentially accelerated. The vast majority of businesses and many workers have had to rely on taxpayer handouts to survive, and every person has had to reflect on what the NHS has or may need to do for them or their loved ones under COVID. The state was and is the backstop no free market economy could provide. But we've also learned through COVID that the state sector and the for-profit sector are also not enough. Most of you on this call today have known that for years. Now we all know it. All those small acts of kindness, all the small battalions of people, the little platoons that kept so many people fed, in better mental state, better well-being generally, and so forth this year, right throughout the country. The three sectors of the economy have often been viewed as totally distinct, but as we've seen, all three sectors affect all of us, albeit in different ways, and all must learn to work better together and benefit from each other's comparative advantages. That phrase, comparative advantage, I first learnt doing my O-level, now called the GCSE, in economics many years ago. It's why we all specialise in our particular jobs, and it's why world trade makes sense. But civil society's comparative advantages, its closeness to the neediest in society, its ability to leverage very limited resources to attract pro bono support, has never been fully recognised and never fully utilised. It has actually at times been taken for granted. Time for change. My discussions with pro bono economics around the Commission predated COVID. It actually came out of a conversation that I had with Andy Haldane and an old mutual friend, Matthew Bramson, who first introduced me to PBE. We had many observations that evening based upon all of our experiences and study, but for me it came down to some really succinct points. Recognition of impact, use that recognition to persuade more people and more resources to scale up, promote the best ideas for all throughout the country to see, and to find some way for policy to better support the structures that would help propel all of that forwards. And so the vision came together. PBE, the perfect institution to run the Commission, given their history of measurement and impact. And given the need to get this into policy, who better to chair it than the former Cabinet Secretary to three different Prime Ministers, Gus O'Donnell. But of course, none of this could happen without the wealth of talent and experience from society itself. And we've had a terrific response to our outreach. We've got 17 great commissioners, 21 fantastic essay contributors, many leaders of charities, representatives from the corporate world who are at the forefront of change in that sector, philanthropists and funders, and all the above, complemented by leading academic knowledge and a leader in the insights of social behaviour. So a huge thank you to you all for everything you've done actually over the decades, as well as over the next couple of years with this commission. Being a numbers person, I'm going to finish up with this. It was stated on the video, but like all things in life, good things should be repeated. Charities employ almost as many people as the financial services industry. It generates around £200 billion of social value. That's equivalent to around 10% of GDP. Let's get the recognition and the impact that that all deserves and unleash civil society in the 2020s. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back over to Gus to introduce our panel.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's delightful to hear someone refer to their O-level in economics. I remember doing mine many years ago, probably more than you. But those were good times. And thank you again for your support for all of this work, which we hoped will meet all of the challenges that have been put forward today. So without further ado, we move to a panel. And first of all, before I introduce the panel, just to say, use Slido, put forward your questions. You'll be able to upvote on all the usual things, and we'll try and get to them as far as we can. Surprise, surprise, the politicians slightly overran, as expected, to be honest. And but we'll try and get in as many questions as we can. So in order to save time, what I'm going to do is ask the panel to introduce themselves, but also to say why they think this commission is needed and what they're bringing to the commission. So the panel speakers are, I'll go through them, Andy Haldane, Vidhya Alakeson, Joel Davis, and James Timpson. And we'll take them in that order. So Andy, over to you.
Gus, thank you. Good morning, still just about morning, everyone. Hope you're all keeping well. I'm Andy Haldane. I'm Chief Economist of the Bank of England, or thought I was, until Gus's introduction. Maybe now an ex-central banker, I don't know. Anyway, more relevant to today is the fact that I'm also founder and trustee of Pro Bono Economics. So why a commission? Well, my narrow answer is that for over a decade now, PBE has aspired to have a wider impact across the social sector, beyond the 500 or so projects we've done with individual charities. You know, if you like, bringing to bear the power of analysis right across the entirety of the social sector. And with the launch of this commission, that objective is now realized, which I'm personally thrilled about. And I'm also extremely grateful to Andrew Law for helping to make that happen. My broader answer, more fundamental answer, Gus, though, is the commission is needed now because a long-standing opportunity for the social sector has, during the course of this year, I think, turned into a genuinely societal necessity. The long-standing opportunity was to unleash even more of the sector's enormous potential, as we've heard about this morning. That means better appreciating and valuing its existing contribution, which I have to say at present is both chronically and systematically underestimated. It's about improving the underlying infrastructure of the social sector, closing the 4 deficits referred to in the excellent background paper, namely the strategic, the digital, the data, and the diversity deficits of the sector. And it's also, I think, about improving the social sector's partnership, keyword, partnership with the private and public sectors, because we all know from our history books that it's only when these 3 pillars act in partnership that our economies and indeed our societies can flourish. Now, the COVID crisis has added urgency to each of these opportunities. Indeed, for me, it's turned them into a set of immediate national necessities. That means investing wisely and for the longer term. That rich endowment of social capital this crisis has spawned. It means creating, as a matter of urgency, more of that social infrastructure that we think is essential to close the gaps, be they economic or financial or social or spatial, which were worryingly large pre-COVID and which I would say are intolerably large now. And ultimately, Gus, it's about building back our economies and societies nationally, but especially locally, not just better, but kinder. The commission is, for me, Gus, about laying those foundations analytically and practically for each of these things, about establishing what you might call a new social contract between the market, the state, and civil society, between governments, businesses, and communities. And if not now, then when? And indeed, what better set of people to do that than those on this panel, Gus, you, Vidhya, Joel, James, and the other commissioners. Gus, let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Andy. Vidhya, over to you.
Thank you, Gus, and I'm really delighted to be one of the commissioners on this panel. So I'm Vidhya Alakeson, I'm the Chief Executive of Power to Change. Power to Change is an independent charitable trust that supports community businesses across England. So this is everything from community shops and pubs to community transport, community-led housing, community hubs, these critical pieces of social infrastructure that exist in many of our communities that are run by local people for the benefit of their local communities and neighbourhoods. So in terms of the perspectives I think I bring two different perspectives, which I think are really critical to this commission. So the first is very much a community and place-based perspective. So community businesses tend to be at the smaller end of civil society. They work with volunteers, 9,000 community businesses work with about 250,000 volunteers, and they have a fundamental and deep connection to place. So that is a particular sort of perspective within civil society. I think the other thing that I bring from our work, community businesses, is a social economy perspective. So community businesses sit at that intersection between business and charity, if you like. Now, they are businesses run for social purpose, for the benefit of local communities. And I think it's really critical, and I know that you intend to, in this work, recognise the breadth and depth, the diversity of civil society, so that it isn't just about the charity sector as we might conventionally think about it. It is about all the different dimensions of civil society and what they bring. So critically, through our work, also bring that social economy perspective. And I think it's critical that we leverage all of those different dimensions in the work that we do as the Commission. In terms of why the Commission now and why it matters to me, I think I'm about to say something similar to Andy, but in slightly different words. But I think in the work that we do with community businesses, we see the critical role that they play in neighbourhoods, the role they play as critical social infrastructure in employing people furthest away from the labour market, the role they play in local economic development. But in our experience, it's still quite an uphill battle to get that fundamental role of civil society at a local place-based level recognised by both central government and local government. And despite the huge upswing in community spirit that we saw in the pandemic and the centrality of community organisations in being our first line of defence, enabling communities to get through the pandemic, it still seems that we have some road to travel to really ensure that community organisations have decision-making seats at the table and that their value is recognised. So what I'm really hopeful about this Commission is that in light of the deep inequalities that exist sort of regionally, structurally within the country that have been brought to light by COVID and are likely to worsen because of COVID and recession, there is a really strong opportunity for us to really make the case that if we want to level up the country, if we want to address those inequalities, that civil society has a key part to play, and we can put forward the evidence that can make that case much more strongly than we have done to date.
Thank you very much, Vidhya. Now over to Joel.
Thank you, Gus. So I'm actually going to address those key points with a little story. So I remember 2000, I finished my GCSEs and then my A-levels in 2013 and had A's and A stars across the board. So you can kind of say that I beat the statistic of an underperforming child who was on meals. But I remember then going on to try to get employment because I had university fees of £9,000 a year. And the consistent message I was receiving from employers was that I couldn't get a job because I had no work experience. So I just remember feeling a deep sense of injustice and saying to myself, you know what, you employers, I'm going to show you, I'm going to become your manager one day and fire you. And that's pretty much what kind of led to me starting Tutors United. So what we do is we hire, train and pay university students and then provide affordable para-tutoring to primary school pupils from low-income and migrant backgrounds. And now currently we're a mini and energetic army of just under 100 members of staff, supporting around 500 to 600 pupils and families each week. So I'm also a non-executive director of Youth Futures Foundation and a trustee of the School for Social Entrepreneurs and the Rank Foundation. And it's interesting because just 8 years ago, I would have been one of the target beneficiaries for the same organizations that I now play a part in leading. However, 8 years ago, I had absolutely no knowledge of their existence or no understanding of the wider context that they operate in, which we now call civil society. And that for me is exactly why I think this commission is really important, because it makes me question how much more of a difference would civil society make if the wider population really understood the different segments that are working to support them and tackle the range of inequalities that are facing the most marginalized communities. And so that pretty much kind of summarizes the features and perspectives that I think I'll bring to the Commission, particularly around addressing inequalities, like within education and employment, but also about how do we go beyond making a difference and impacting individuals and actually go to addressing the imbalances faced by families and communities overall.
Joel, thank you very much. You're far too humble, so I'll have to add that you were the 2013 Future Leaders Award winner, 2014 John Lewis Young Person of the Year, 2019 Third Sector Awards Rising Chief Executive of the Year, and Tutors United is doing an amazingly successful charity. So, so no pressure there. James, a man who is Timpson, a great philanthropist and a model to a lot of us. James, over to you.
Well, I'm a cobbler really, and I run our family business, which is 2,000 little shops around the UK. And what I'm really interested in, as aside from business, is how we can engage our colleagues in helping others. So that's why we employ over 500 ex-offenders, or returning citizens, as we like to call our colleagues we recruited from prison. And I'm also interested in the concept of kindness. So that's really how we run our business, based on trust and kindness, and employing people often overlooked by other companies and organisations. The reason why I'm really interested in all the work that we're talking about today is the opportunity that this gives us. Whereas we've heard lots about whacking the mole. I'm interested in finding the opportunities over the next 2 years and finding ways of putting it on a plate for government and the wider society to grab it and to use this opportunity, because it is so powerful. From my perspective, running a business that's been heavily impacted by COVID, we don't just have shops, we also have pubs as well, which is even worse. But what I'm seeing is the power of kindness and community in helping. We've had colleagues who died, we've had lots of colleagues who've had other issues around COVID with their families. So I find it absolutely fascinating what business and what other organisations can do to help people, but also benefit from that as well. So I'm interested in employment, and I'm interested in the criminal justice system, and I'm interested in how kindness can pull it all together.
Thank you very much, James. So just a reminder, please, remember to send in your questions. There are people monitoring them, and they'll pass them through to me. And I will try and get the panel to come up with answers. So the first one that's come through is about the definition of the civil society. Given the diversity within the sector, how do we define it? Andy, you're good with the stats. Tell us how we might approach that sort of question.
Well, thanks, Gus. I probably can't do very much better. Well, I certainly can't do any better than the material set out in the launch document, actually, which goes through a whole sequence of potential definitions of civil society. It doesn't have as ready-made a wrapper as most of the sectors, and of course therein lies some of the problem. It's a slightly more amorphous mass of activity, some of it formal, with a formal legal structure, a great part of it acting in a more informal way, without any legal identity. And of course, therein lies some of the challenge when it comes to not just defining the sector, but defining its contribution at a societal level. What we do know is that there are over 100,000 social enterprises. There are more than 150,000 charities. There are more than 200,000 community groups across the UK. We know that 20 million people regularly volunteer. We know those numbers have been rapidly rising during the course of this year. And of course, that's before you even get to those many, many millions of small, informal acts of neighbourliness that have, fortunately, been the stock in trade of our society during the course of this year. So You can start formally, you could add in the informal, whichever way you cut it. This is a sector that is huge, that is growing, yet despite all of that, is relatively speaking underestimated and under-recording. And that's one of the big challenges, I would say, for the Commission, to do a better job of defining and measuring this currently sometimes rather amorphous mass that is too often invisible to the naked eye.
Thank you, Andy. And the next question I'm going to put to Vidhya, Joel and James, just to warn you, it is about the independence of the sector and their ability to speak up in public debate. What do you feel about that? Do you want to start off, Vidhya?
Yeah, so I think this is obviously an issue that lots of charities face with the Lobbying Act, and Rachel spoke quite eloquently about the limitations of that. I mean, I think the challenge that we see is less a public platform, but about getting, or is also the challenge of getting a seat at the table. So we still see far too often decisions made about how to support needs in communities or how to reach different segments of communities without civil society organisations, in our case, particularly community organisations, having that critical decision-making seat at the table. So what we're really keen to see happen is much more upfront strategic involvement of community organisations, so that they're speaking truth to power at the decision-making table, not just in the public domain in terms of lobbying and speaking truth to power in that way. I think we need sort of change on both fronts, both the behind the scenes strategic round the table seats, as well as more freedom to express views in public and hold power to account that way.
Thank you, Vidhya. Joel?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I'll just add that I think probably what we need to do is actually create much more of a space for organisations to be able to have their voice heard. So again, even if I just zoom in and kind of hone in on charities and social enterprises, we have to find a way of trading, find a proxy market, then actually deliver the service, deliver the product to the beneficiaries. Then on top of that, measure the difference you're making to their lives. And then after all of that, make a surplus as well. That's a lot of work to do. And then on top of that, actually, if we just kind of remind ourselves that the majority of charities and social enterprises are not multi-million organizations, the majority of them are actually small to medium-sized enterprises. Actually, it's very, very, very hard to do the delivery, but the advocacy at the same time. So I think that actually the external environment around us needs to change, and we need to have a much more of a platform to be able to have our voices heard.
Thank you, Joel. You also add to your skills telepathy, because the next question I was given was talk about the importance of social enterprises. How did you know? James, going back to the original one, and also you might want to cover the issue about social enterprises, but the whole point about independence of the sector and when it should speak up and when possibly not.
So the problem that I've had over the years is that we employ people from prison who've burgled your house and done armed robberies, and then you go into our shops and they cut your keys. So we've always had this battle, but I decided to be open and honest about it, but I needed far more cover from the government, which I eventually got. We had headlines, killer cobbler cuts keys and this kind of stuff. But I think it took a long time for us to have the confidence to be honest about what we did, but I needed the cover from government to do that. But I'd also like the government and the wider public sector to embrace the things they're asking us to do, whether it's employing veterans, employing care leavers, certainly on the employment side of things, and also working and giving business to social enterprises rather than the normal large private sector organisations. I think that's something that is really important for them to do. And so far as social enterprises go, although I run a business, I see myself as running a big social enterprise. We make a profit that we put back into growing the business, but the most important part of my job is looking after my colleagues and doing what I can to amaze them and to support them. But I come across a lot of social enterprises. A lot of them are led by inspirational, amazing individuals who often spend too much time trying to find money rather than doing really good work. But often they need help and guidance from people who are experienced in running larger organisations. So I think there's a lot of help that can be done in that direction too.
Thanks very much, James. Next question. Only 10% of people think charities are, quotes, very effective. Are they right, or is this a problem of public perception? Andy, do you want to kick off with that?
Never believe an opinion poll, Gus. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows for sure. And one of the reasons what we don't know and we can't know actually is because there is no systematic way of measuring the efficiency or the effectiveness of what sometimes as economists call productivity, very arid expression, of this sector. It's one of the many things that essentially goes entirely unmeasured within the social sector, and one big gap I think we need to plug so we can have an informed and authoritative discussion about, which charities say are doing well from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective, and which ones are still playing catch up. And once you have that data, you're much better placed to think about how best to enable charities that are lagging to catch up with those that are doing well. I strongly suspect, and I suspect most people on this webinar would feel the same, that there's probably plenty of scope to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of large parts of the charitable sector. By the way, the same is true of the corporate sector. I'm saying nothing of civil society that I wouldn't say was equally true of indeed parts of government and parts of the private sector as well. But could the sector benefit from some more comprehensive digital makeover? My answer to that would be a resounding yes. Does that mean 90% are ineffective? I've got no idea. But can we do better? I'm sure the answer to that, Gus, must be yes.
Thank you very much, Andy. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Okay. The next question is one that unusually, I think I'll try and answer myself first. So the question is, what confidence can we give people that recommendations made by this commission will actually be acted on? Very good question. And I can assure you, I am not going to devote the next 2 years of my life to produce a worthy report that sits on a bookshelf. I have no interest whatsoever in doing that sort of thing. I have, curiously enough, dealt a lot with government. That's why we've got the current Secretary of State and the Shadow Minister here today. You've heard from both of them. There's plenty of common ground here. There's plenty of things that we all need to do. To my mind, there is very much a shared agenda. There's a lot of recommendations we can do which will actually make the world a better place, that will make charities more effective, that will, as we said at the start, unleash the potential. So I think our job, the job of everyone on the commission and the job of all of you listening in to help us, is to come up with recommendations that are really good recommendations, that will really make a difference and that are, as I said, practical and implementable. And it's then a lot of us, our job, and I see it as my job in particular, to try and make sure and that governments cannot evade this, that we create the conditions which make it politically acceptable and indeed inevitable that they should follow these recommendations. So that's a challenge for us, but it's a challenge that I've managed quite a few times, and I look forward to doing again with the help of all of my wonderful commissioners. So next question is, what is the role and importance of social sector infrastructure bodies for unleashing the potential of civil society? Vidhya, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we see there being a really critical role for infrastructure in supporting the effectiveness and efficiency of civil society organisations. So as a funder, since we got going in 2015, we have always committed funding to infrastructure organisations because we recognise the value that they contribute. to the wider sector. And I think that's, we've seen through the pandemic a change in other funders who have not really supported infrastructure organisations over the last decade, but through the pandemic have decided to shift and now are supporting infrastructure organisations. I think all of the evidence that we have suggests that a sector without strong infrastructure to enable it to improve and embrace digital, etc., is a weaker sector. I think that doesn't, much as Andy said earlier about the need for improvement within civil society organisations, the same upskilling, embracing digital, etc., is necessary for infrastructure organisations. But one without the other is weaker in my view.
Thank you, Vidhya. So the next question, I can tell you this. This is the FT Weekend magazine when it used to be serious rather than just a bunch of adverts. And the title is Mission Improbable. Can Gus O'Donnell persuade the world that economists are useful? And the question we've got, which I will put to the Bank of England's chief economist, what can economists add to the debate on civil society? And what are the dangers of this?
Gracious. We're speaking as a former chief economist of the Bank of England, Gus. I hope what economists are able to bring, and indeed, more importantly, what pro bono economics has been able to achieve over the last more than decade, it has been putting centre stage issues of data, issues of measurement and impact, and issues in particular of better quantifying and understanding the societal contribution that civil society plays, and we're fortunately endowed with tools that enable us to break into those questions. We've applied those tools over the last more than decade in helping tell, I hope, better stories about the true scale of the contribution the sector has generated. The other thing, though, I think would be quite valuable for the Commission, Gus, is in thinking about the structure of sectors, the structure of industries, and the ways in which they can be improved. I think it's terrific and really important that this Commission is not looking at the social sector in isolation, but very much its partnership alongside the business sector, the private sector, and the government sector. Because, just as I would say, I'm sure James would agree with that, there's huge amounts, large parts of business could learn from civil society in terms of becoming more purposeful. There may well be large amounts that civil society can itself learn from the private sector when it comes, for example, to those issues of technology and efficiency. And what economics hopefully gives you and can contribute to this project is thinking about those incentives and those market failures that could help unleash more of the potential of the social sector. What are the barriers, the frictions, the failures that could unleash this sector's even greater potential?
Thank you, Andy. We are running close towards the end. What I'm going to do is throw together the two final questions I've got here and ask you all. I'll start with James to answer this. First of all, we've asked, how can the Commission engage with a wide range of people, including young people? And the second one is, how can we improve the way we measure success, not just using return on investment? And I think if panel members could also say what for them would be success from the Commission. What is it they want to see? So James, let's start with you. And then Joel, then Vidhya, then Andy.
Okay, so how can the Commission engage with young people? I think there are already a vast amount, there's a huge amount of expertise on the Commission already, and we need to make sure that we speak to as many of our connections as possible. And what I'm really interested in is to speak to people who are good at getting things done. and are good at making change. So, so far as young people in my world, we're interested in care leavers, attachment, and teaching, and I'm hoping to spend quite a bit of time in that area, especially with care leavers. So, how do we measure success? Well, like you said earlier on, Gus, I like to be involved in things that get things done. And for me, I'm a big believer in helping people take on an idea and they think it's their own. So I would love to get to a stage where the people we are working alongside, principally the government, take this as theirs and then run with it. Even if we know that we've done the majority of the work, if they think it's theirs, they will be more likely to get on and do it. And that to me is a success.
Thank you, James. Joel, I agree with James in that I'm still with pride, I would say. Yeah, they're happy to.
For me, I would say it's literally as simple as putting feelers out there and literally just putting out the communication. But I would say it's important to engage frontline organizations to make sure that we are successfully engaging young people. And I would say crucially, it's actually all about the communication, making sure we are engaging with all the different types of segments of young people. So we're engaged with young people with disabilities, young people with special educational needs, young people who are care leavers, etc. Making sure that we are getting and hearing the voices of everyone as opposed to just a specific group of young people. And that for me is actually kind of links in with what I think success looks and feels like. For me, it's as simple as success is if we are successfully amplifying the voices of the most marginalized communities and families.
Thank you, Joel. Vidhya.
So I think, and I know you're on this very much at PBE. I think we've got our combined connections to reach out very widely across the sector, and as well as young people, we need to ensure that we're reaching out to the diversity of the sector across all those sort of dimensions of race, sex, all of the different elements of diversity, so that we're really reflecting the richness of civil society, and also that we as a commission are willing to engage in different ways of engaging, so whether they be digital or town hall meetings, the whole gamut, which obviously is more difficult in the COVID era, but I think we need to challenge ourselves to not just engage in ways that we as the commissioners are comfortable with, and to open up to other ways of doing things. In terms of success, I think in my role where I'm particularly focused on government, but I actually think the success of this commission will be both in situating civil society within that broader context, as others have already talked about, of government and the private sector, and in having meaningful things to say to each of the sectors. So the commission wants to talk to civil society itself, but it would be also really valuable if it has strong things to say to business as well as to government. This can't all be just about a government facing set of outcomes. I think it needs to be across all three.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vidhya. Andy.
I mean, all crises, Gus, as you know, are huge learning experiences, and this one will be no exception. And I think in terms of the lessons this crisis has taught us, it's taught us huge amounts about what matters, family, friends, communities, our own health. It's told us huge amounts about who matters, all of those key workers, including among which I'd of course include almost all of civil society and all those volunteers. But it's also taught us huge amounts, I think, about how we keep score on what matters. And so that does mean putting absolutely center stage issues of well-being, issues of happiness, and issues of, to echo a word that's been used a lot today, and I'm delighted it has been used a lot today, kindness. So success for me of the Commission would be putting issues of kindness and well-being centre stage. Indeed, success for the economy and society looking forward, probably also defined in terms of doing a better job on those things as well.
Andy, thank you. That's a great handover. This is almost like a planted question, because allows me to give a plug to an article I got in the Financial Times today about well-being. That point that James made about kindness and about how society would be different if we all tried to work together to improve the well-being, particularly of those with very low levels of well-being, of which unfortunately the COVID crisis has expanded the numbers. I should also add to that question about who we'll engage with, that we intend to go beyond the usual suspects, as it were, and try and reach out. I know it's particularly difficult to get various groups. Young people have often been left out of these things, and we will make particular efforts to ensure that we have good ways of listening and learning from as wide a group as possible. So it remains for me to say thank you very much to all of you for your questions, your great questions. Thank you for listening. Please carry on engaging with us. If you want invitations to future events, sign up to the newsletter. Click yes in that chat box. That's a way of keeping in touch and keeping us honest, making sure that we listen to you. Secondly, big thanks to all the speakers and our great panel. Well done, all of you. Great answers. Please read the wonderful essays published on the website and the two reports that I mentioned at the start. This has been a great start to what I hope will be a really significant commission, which will produce results which will actually make a real difference. So thank you to all of you. Please stay with us and enjoy the rest of the day. May the force be with you. All the very best.